Okay, good morning, and thanks for already showing a high pain threshold and showing up for this. It's advertised as multi-weeks, and to be a little more precise, it's meant to be like 19 weeks. And hopefully that's not an obstacle, but rather a gift when we're looking at a book that is like relatively thick. By the way, format-wise, you don't have to read this book, but I think it would be helpful. And having read it twice myself in preparation for my last trip to Greece at the recommendation of sort of like my favorite professor and biblical scholar on Paul, who's at Baylor, and I think he was right. I hope that if you do read this book, you will find it accessible, like it's not pedantic. It doesn't use a bunch of lexicography that is just requires a dictionary. I don't think it does anyway. But also like very clear in the case that he makes that most of the tension modern readers have with Paul comes from the Middle Ages, not from Paul's own time. You have to decide whether you find that compelling or not, but at least it's nice to have a both and. So this book is a background for us, as are the scriptures, right? If you had to pick between the two, pick the scriptures. I'm always going to say that as like somebody who was raised to love the Bible, but you don't always have to pick between the two. How are we going to use the two books? This is like good to say up front. Over the next several weeks, there's sort of a curated syllabus that this particular online course, it's sort of hybrid, offers. Usually what we'll do is gather with a lecture from N.T. Wright, who is a fantastic speaker, scholar, used to be a priest in the Church of England, has a very strong degree in ancient historiography, but also in languages. So how many of you are familiar with N.T. Wright, just off the bat? Yeah, so I hope you'll find him a cogent, a clear, coherent, and innovative thinker all at once. So each week, other than today, we'll start with a short message from N.T. Wright based on the book of the Bible that we're reading. So just looking ahead, today's introduction, we're all fine. Next week is Galatians. And in order to get ready for next week, the background is that we're going to look at Galatians, which means if you wanted to be, and I'll tell you a week in advance what we're doing, right? Galatians, and the week after that, we'll be doing Philippians. So how am I going to prepare for next week? I'm going to read the chapter in here called Cyprus and Galatia, and I'm going to read the book of Galatians from my Bible. That's my personal preparation. I want you to hear you always have options. You can read nothing. Delighted for you to come to listen and interact. You could read just this. You could read just the Bible. You could read something else. There's lots of options, not trying to bury you in homework, just trying to say these are the resources and how you may choose to use them. Now, if you've looked at this book already, then you might be saying, whoa, hey, there's an introduction in here. There's a chapter on zeal. There's a chapter on Arabia and Tarsus. There's a chapter on Antioch, and Paul didn't write a letter to the Antiochians or the Tarsusians or the Arabians. So like, when are we going to read those? Whenever you want. And those chapters I've mentioned take about 100 pages of this book. So read them whenever you choose. I've already read them. I didn't tell you you have to read them. So I hope you don't feel like you're behind, because you don't have to read any of it. But in your spare time, you might read some of this introductory material. I, for one, have found all of it very helpful. I don't just recommend any of it. The chapter on zeal is very helpful to understand what Paul was doing with Stephen and where that came from in his reading of what we call the Hebrew Bible. The chapter on Arabia was very helpful to understand what it meant for Paul to go on sort of a missionary journey in consonance with the prophet Elijah. the prophet on Antioch is, the chapter on Antioch, very helpful to understand how Paul is kind of cutting his teeth after he has this vision on the road to Damascus that many of us are very familiar with. And of course, these are helpful because he doesn't just mention these things. He talks about what they likely would have meant for Paul, and therefore are an entry point for not only to understand, but to mirror and apply. So that's the goal, is not that we leave with a new fact pattern, but that we leave with a new invitation of what it is Paul is offering us. You may, at points in this discussion time together, you may find yourself saying like, okay, I get that it meant that for him and like good for him, but I hate that. That's fine to share. That's fine to share. You may say, well, I mean, I just like the traditional read and I don't care about this. That's okay too. You are totally okay to share that. So the goal is not that we all leave with the same understanding, but hopefully that we leave with a new understanding. My friend Rabbi Stuart Federer says, jokingly but seriously, whenever there are two Jews gathered together, there will always be three opinions. And that sounds like an anti-Semitic joke, but he follows it up with, one speaker has a thesis. This is very Hegelian, by the way. The listener has an antithesis, like but, and in true dialogue, both people leave with a synthesis. It doesn't have to be the same idea, but they leave changed. And that's the difference between monologue swapping, which you will see on any debate politically, monologue swapping, and dialogue, which is based about really hearing and thinking through and coming away different. So that's a big goal I have for our time together. We'll see if we sort of meet it or not. So first, let me see if we have any like procedural or format questions about what I'm hoping we do for next week, and then I'll talk about what I'd like us to do today. Is that okay? Yes, sir.
Is it important that I guess you'll give parts of the book, I should note it, and that will, as you said, you have your opinion, things come away good. Or that a typical Bible study, we'll go book by book and do the same.
Yeah, and so I'm glad you asked that. Unlike the studies I grew up doing, I don't need you to think what I think. And I will probably try to provoke you. Do what you want with that, but I like the Jewish model that the point is to consider and to disagree and then come back. It's very healthy to push what it can mean, and not all of us like it, but we're committed to coming back. Now, you may say, "This is not a good use of my time, I'm not coming back." That's okay, but I hope you hear what I'm saying. The church that raised me said there's no room for difference of opinion. There's a party line. I even had a few people say, I don't know if I'm Episcopalian enough. That thought makes you Episcopalian. I mean, it really does. What's great about the Episcopal Church, the big tent model is there's somebody like you somewhere in the Anglican communion, so you're never alone. And that's kind of consoling, which means there's room for you wherever you are. Even if your approach is, I don't even believe any of this stuff, but he's an important icon in Western philosophical tradition. That does not exclude you from what we're doing. Does not exclude you. I mean, N.T. Wright provocatively says, right, this is the story of the greatest public intellectual of all time. That's kind of interesting. You may say, what about Jesus? I mean, you make up your own mind about this, but as Jesus wrote nothing, there's a case to be made, right? It's sort of interesting to think through. I hope that was helpful, Joe. I hope that was helpful. Again, I don't need you to think what I think, and hopefully at the end, you don't know what I think. You just know what I said. Those are different things, aren't they? Any other thoughts, questions? Okay, one other format thing, if you're missing, and that'll happen, we'll travel, whatever. What do I do if I miss? My best thought, because I'm going to be showing you copywritten material, which means I can't post that on our YouTube without doing something like I feel really greasy about. I could probably get away with it, but who wants to do that, right? So I'll show you this lecture from N.T. Wright each week. And then it's probably easiest if you miss for you to say, can you send me the URL for that video? Instead of me posting it, I'll record it, but keep the recording not public, which means you need a link to see it. And my other alternative would be record everything but the lecture and then give you my login code for the Udemy site so that you can see the lecture, and that feels less good to me. That way you get it all in one go. Does that make sense? So if you ever miss, your best option is I missed weeks 2 and 7, and I'm remiss in saying I want them, but I do. Send me those codes because I own them and they'll be YouTube recordings, but not publicly searchable or posted. If that doesn't make sense, just email me when you miss and I'll send you the code. And it'll be a link that you click on and it shows you the whole thing. Okay, any other thoughts? Please also hear, you're here and you don't have to be here. You're voluntarily here. Maybe this is penance for you. Maybe you're interested in something that I'm not going to choose to talk about. Since you're volunteers, it's your time. So make good use of your time. Hey, thanks. Could we talk about this? At any point. Please make the most of your time. Of course, we also know, right, that some of us are more eager to speak than others. So I'm going to invite us to make one comment and then wait before we make our second comment to give other people turns. If we forget, I'll remind you. That's my job, is to be the facilitator, not the instructor. Does that make sense, that goal? I love talking. If you know me, you already know that. So I'll try to follow my own rule and not overdo this. Because again, the important thing is not that you come away knowing what I think, but that we've engaged this material thoughtfully and really with what does it mean for us. So those are the important goals I have. And now I've done this thing that I would like to invite each of you to do, if you're willing. This is very un-Episcopalian, asking you to participate. You can pass, but I would like you, if you pass, to at least sort of say who you are. So what I'd like you to do is just sort of say, what's your name? Why are you here? What would you like to learn? Or what would you ask the Apostle Paul if he were in the room and able to reply? So I've kind of told you my goal, right? Is that we engage with this material, that we stretch our thinking, not just at a fact level, but our invitation for Paul's vision of discipleship and where we fit into that. That's what I want to do. And I guess I would also tell you, one of my goals is that we do get a different opportunity on what Paul was about. Instead of coercion and misogyny and sexual prudishness and a new law that we don't have to follow, but you better, I'm hoping we come away with a more life-giving reading than maybe we've been told or handed. So that's what I would like to do, and my name is Mike. Who wants to start us off? John, thank you.
John McFarland. What I want to learn from this, there are a couple of things. I want to learn more about Paul, obviously. I would like to get a better understanding of his thoughts on the world and how they would change or not for today compared to when he wrote everything he wrote and said everything he said. And hear all of y'all's thoughts.
Thank you.
Mary McFarland, want to learn more about Paul? No expectation.
Oh, I have one more time. Why is my book so much thinner than everybody?
Small
else's?
print.
Same book.
Wow.
He probably is on 10-point font.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm John L. Bridchick, and I enjoy the past studies that you've had, and so I'm interested in learning more about Paul and hearing everybody else's thoughts and.
My name's Kate. I love the ancient world. I love the intersection of Christianity with the context of the ancient world. And I'm here to have my mind changed.
I'm Christine. I have been Episcopalian all my life but I want to know more and I want to learn about Paul.
I'm Rodney Allen. I came out of the evangelical Pentecostal charismatic thing. And I want to know, since there's such a big deal about eternal conscious torment in that world, how come Paul never mentioned it? And what does he think about that? So,
Thank you.
I'm Sue Allen. I just want to learn more, I want to grow, I want to change, and, you know, by doing this, so I'm
Rebecca, and I'm here today because I've really been ignorant of anything historical before, and I think I want to change that, so.
Y'all want to go or you want me to go?
I'm Teresa, it's Teresa Finn, and I just wanted to learn more basically about the books of the Bible and study Paul's word. I'm trying to see, you know, where it fits in with the relationship with the other interpretations of the New Testament, you know, the New Testament.
I'm Mike Moody. One of the reasons I'm here is because my wife is a chiropractor. And she and I are reading this, we read a book in the evening as part of our evening devotional prayer time. We are reading this book every night. And so I think I'm learning some new things about Paul. I'm not always agreeing with some of his scholarship. Not all, but maybe right.
Yeah, yeah.
But that would be the first time for that. But anyway, I'm looking forward to just a discussion and giving a new perspective on one of the great curmudgeons of history.
Thank you.
I'm Joseph Jeans, my wife, Adele. 6 years we've been here. I have probably done every letter in Paul at the second Bible study. And there's another Bible study of Paul the Gospel. But I am living in Noel. Guess what? You'll make friends that way. People will respect you. People really respect you when you listen. And I'll probably do that. And I'll try to, I would say the fifth thing when it comes.
Adele?
My name's Adele, and my sense of Paul is just the excerpts we hear, that I've heard, you know, at Eucharist and Mass, and so I'm looking forward to reading, you know, more of the whole letters and learning more about kind of real knowledge.
Thank you.
I'm Kate Cloutier, and I read this book about a year ago on the recommendation of mine, because I always thought that Paul was very controversial figure to me, and I really didn't get him very well, so I read this book, and it helped a lot. It changed a lot of my reading style, and I think it's helpful.
Thank you.
I'm Mary Ruth, and I'm here just to learn more because I've never really studied law. And I think it'll be a very interesting conversation.
My name is Michael Conway, and I'm always interested in learning more about the characters in the Bible.
I'm Sandy Conway. I just want to learn more about Paul. Because I like listening to mine.
Okay. Ellen?
I'm Ellen Cook, and I'm here partly because I have had a negative feeling about Paul through the years, but not a very informed. And another thing that fascinates me is how somebody could travel as far and as much as he did in those times.
Cindy?
I'm Cindy Roper, and I'm here because I haven't taken a Bible study in way too long. Yes, I'm calling myself out. It's that Catholic guilt upbringing from my mother. But anyway, and I think it'll also help because I'm going on a trip to Greece. It will help me understand Paul better and appreciate where we're going to be going on this trip.
Okay, Susan Schroyer, and when you did Corinthians, I did a little extra reading on Paul, and Paul seemed to support women, but I have a friend that is very anti-Paul because she calls him out as a misogynist, which I've only ever heard from her, and so I want to get kind of the rest of the story. Maybe get her to listen to it.
Louis Delgado, I'm here for two reasons, both of them were used by other people, so one, because my wife brought them. The other, Kay said, my knowledge of Paul is just from the readings of the Bible, here in service. And I found a lot of those dense in his work.
Kathy Delgado, and I'm here because Paul's negative reputation has preceded him, and I have avoided learning anything about him, so I think this will be very useful.
Thank you.
I'm Julia Triple. I'm here because I like our community and being around y'all is very fulfilling for me. And listening to the various perspectives that everybody has is also really fulfilling. And I am hopeful to learn something. Thank you.
I'm Alyssa Keene. I'm here because I grew up studying and following more Paul than Jesus in a Christian church, and I've kind of, since I've been following Jesus more and less Paul, kind of shunned Paul, and so I'm ready to get back into it.
I'm Amelia Blanco, and I think it was a sermon that Mike did back in April, and he mentioned this book. And I think I listened to that on YouTube several times before I said, okay, I'm getting the book. And I promptly got the book and started reading it, but life got in the way, so now I definitely want to know more. We also at my school do a lot of recitation. The kids, I mean, and we teach it, and we often recite Paul. So
my name's Richard Keene. I'm realizing I think I'm here because I'm hoping I'll rekindle my muted zealousness in Paul and in maybe a more healthy and balanced way.
Thank you. Kathy?
Yeah, Kathy Reinhold, glad to be here. Like Julia, I get fed by learning and hearing y'all learn. And last year at Iona, I took a year of study and was really intrigued by Paul, because I don't know much either. And this whole idea of who's Paul and who's Pauline, I never really got that. So looking forward to some conversation about it.
Thank you.
Morella Byer, interested in Paul and his travels and collaboration with Luke.
I'm Jim, and I know nothing about Paul. So this is an introduction for me.
Great.
I'm Barbara Gaines. There's two reasons. One, because we were gonna, do the Greek trip, which, was following all steps, so I want to learn about that. And Jim would be considered very knowledgeable about history of the Bible and stuff, as opposed to me. I know nothing. So, I wasn't brought up being taught that way. I was brought up going to Catholic school, and we didn't focus on that as a structure, so I know zero.
I'm Jane Flynn, and I'm here to learn more about Paul and kind of shed my 1960s, 70s Methodist perception of Paul.
I'm Bonnie Bryan, and what Kathy Delgado said. My impression of Paul has not always been positive, so hopefully this will change.
I'm Valerie. I find Paul interesting because he communicated through letters. And I'm interested in that communication. Paul, you know, the way he communicated, and he was a very articulate writer.
I'm Eddie Teresa. I'm just here to learn more and more about Paul.
I'm Robert Walker, lifelong Episcopalian. I have been in Bible study fellowship for about 20 years. And this is my first study with Reverend Wright, and anxious to enhance my understanding of Paul.
Thank you. Bob, how about you?
Yeah, sorry, I just realized now the sun is coming over the rooftop here, so I'm sorry if I'm like
Our own Damascus Road experience.
I am very much haloing right now. Sorry. Yeah, so I'm realizing now that this format with Zoom is not, ideal for hearing everybody, so we're gonna have to work that out. Many of you know I have 3 young kids at home, but if I intend to stick with this, I gotta get in that space with you guys so I can actually hear you. That said, I kind of fancy myself this amateur philosopher. In my spare time, I read a lot of philosophy, and a lot of the thinkers that I'm interested in have turned their attention to Paul lately. So much so that there's been this Pauline turn, they're calling it, in recent philosophy. And they're kind of elevating Paul as this figure of kind of militant political activism that he embodies or represents. And so, philosophers tend to abstract and rip things out of context and run wild with the thought or the thinking. And so this was kind of nice that N.T. Wright, and I think his book will help kind of ground and contextualize his thinking for me a little bit. And I think scripture will also kind of ground and contextualize his thinking a little bit more for me. But yeah, I'm really eager to explore what those perspectives and yours each kind of provide for me.
Thank you. Okay, so how do we be good stewards of our rest of our time today? It's sort of up to you. I mean, in some ways, I would be very happy to tell you more about greater ancient Near Eastern context as affects Paul. That would be me talking. But at any point, you could say, I don't want to do that. I'd also be happy to sort of review a little bit chapters on zeal and Sinai and Tarsus and Antioch. That also might be me talking, which I say I don't want to do too much, and I mean it after today. Or you may want to say, hey, I said the general, but like, here's this thing that I really like, can we talk about it now? Or like, where is this going? I don't know what makes the most sense.
More historical background.
I have quite a dichotomy, not even finishing the 2 first chapters and 6 in Galatians. I think it's quite serious and it kind of goes up and down. This relationship with Paul in Jerusalem, mainly Caiaphas, Peter, and not so much John and James, who's not the apostle, that's
The brother of the Lord, yeah.
But Wyatt, and I don't think they quite lie, but they tell their congregations, and that is extremely. Because I think they had us. And Paul said, Peter agreed, I'll deal with the Jews, and Paul will deal with the Gentiles. Now, they allowed, Peter to bring in the Jewish traditions of mainly, through the circumcision. But when Peter and Paul met in public, I believe in Antioch, much later, and Peter had quite a big following in the Gentiles. And he had told the Gentiles, no, you don't need to be a Jew. And of course, Peter was placating.
Can I pause you, Joe? Joe's talking about some of the tensions in Galatians between, hey, did Paul actually talk? Paul says, I got this all from the Lord. I didn't get it from other people. But they had talked about some other things, right? And then there's some of the tension between the mission to the Gentiles, quote unquote, versus the mission to the Jews. Peter does one, Paul does the other. I think that's a great question for next week when we read Galatians. It's a great question.
Now I threw it out as just that.
Yeah.
I didn't want to start.
Thank you. And by the way, I would invite you when you read next week, reading Galatians, to consider this question that the Bible's not going to ask you. What does it take to be a good Christian today? And I want you to answer it just like I asked it. What do good Christians do? So I want you to think about that when you read. And I want you to be honest. And if you say nothing, you're not being honest. Because it's baked into us that good people do stuff. My opinion, anyway. That's my opinion. Would you read that when you think about Galatians? Other thoughts for this morning? Yeah.
Just what you were saying about looking at it from a medieval perspective versus his
Yeah.
Wright says we ask questions from that perspective than what first people are asking.
Yeah, good. Having read the book, I know what he does and doesn't do. So I want to talk about that one briefly and a little bit of more context. And again, interrupt me if I'm boring you. Salvation, oh, yes, ma'am. Oh, I'm not going to get it word for word, but the tension between the medieval perspective and the ancient Near Eastern perspective. Yeah. So if you grew up in church like I did, the point of church and Jesus and Paul is to make sure you don't go to, and that's the medieval perspective. Anybody know where the concept of hell comes from in the ancient Near East? Yeah.
Gehenna?
Yeah, Gehenna. Gehenna is a word in Hebrew, not Greek, and it's a valley outside the city of Jerusalem. So it means the Hinnom Valley. This is the word that often gets translated by medieval theologians into the word hell, but it's important you know that the word means the relative minimum point outside the city of Jerusalem. What happened in the Hinnom Valley, Gehinnom? Two things happened there in the ancient world. First, there were a group of people, you can read about them throughout the Bible, who worshiped different gods of the earth. Now consider, when you worship a god of the sky, you go to the high point. When you worship the gods of the earth, you go to a low point, yeah? So it's the low point. And the way you worship the gods of the earth is through this barter system. The more I give God, the more God has to return to me. By the way, all of us buy into that at some point, whether we admit it or not. Intellectually, you may say no way, but experientially, the more you give, the more you get. That's the great capitalist story, isn't it? So all of us have some of that in us. So what's the most important thing you had in the ancient world? And wasn't money in a pre-monetary economy. It was your firstborn son, who is your legacy, your namesake, the one who's going to own the land. So if you gave your firstborn son to God, well, that's the best you got. So God's going to give you something back. These gods are named Chemosh and Milcom. And because they're gods of the earth, you went to the relative low point and you burned your firstborn child alive. Why would you do that? Well, you see, once you convert a child into ashes, there's nothing left to take back. There's no lending. It's a full conversion. And beyond that, right? Since gods are invisible to the eye, you're taking a visible thing and rendering it essentially invisible. I don't know if that's what people were thinking, right? But this is sort of like how sociologists approach how that practice got up, right? By the way, there's two kings in the tradition of Israel who do that to their own children. One is Josiah's son, Manasseh. He takes his firstborn son to the Gehinnom Valley and burns him alive. The other identification of the Gehinnom Valley, since it's a low point, is that on those days of high sacrifice, and there's a lot of what coming out of an animal when you sacrifice it? Blood. Blood, like water, flows downhill to the Gehinnom Valley. Finally, it's a place in the ancient world where you burn your trash. Not plastics. They didn't have plastics. What's trash? Stuff that's ripped and no good anymore. You go and burn it. So that's literally what happens there. So I think we have to consider, is hell a place you go to be tormented forever? That's Dante's idea. But the Gehinnom Valley, hell, is when you kill your own child to worship God. That's living in hell. I hope we can all agree. When you give someone up because you think that's what God wants, you have entered hell. Hell is also a place where trash is meant to be burned, not built up as an altar. And hell is where our leftovers inevitably flow. Well, that doesn't sound like the medieval hell at all. That's because it wasn't. In Paul's time, in Jesus's time, there was not a bifurcation when you die. There were ideas about that, but they were very new. You read the Hebrew Bible, people don't go to heaven or hell. They go to the place of the dead, which is either called the pit or Sheol or the grave. Good, bad, rich, poor, young, old. Everybody goes to the pit, which is sort of underground and really dark. So eternality of the soul is a Greek idea, not a Hebrew idea. Dualism about reward when you die or punishment when you die also is some kind of mishmash between Zoroastrian principles, that's Persia, and Greek ideas, not in your Hebrew Bible anywhere. I'm not saying it's wrong. What I'm saying is it was still an idea. By the Middle Ages, it was a doctrine. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I'm not saying there's no hell. I've lived in hell. If you know an alcoholic, they live in hell. If you know someone with an eating disorder, they live in hell. Hell is where you burn your children as an offering to God. Does God want your children burned? Hell no. I hope you don't mind me saying that. So this is like really important to consider the context for this. Yeah.
Where does purgatory come in?
Purgatory is a gracious idea that our I shouldn't say Roman, that our Catholic brethren developed. They said, listen, if you steal something, that's a temporary action. So God won't punish you forever for a thing you did that doesn't last forever. I mean, it's actually relatively gracious, right? Purgatory is based on the idea of scales. You do something wrong, you make up for it. And then God forgives you. You do the crime, you do the time, but no crime on earth is forever. Does that make sense? It's actually very gracious compared to, you screwed up, so you're going to hell forever. That also comes in the Middle Ages, because they said this whole either or thing, guys, that just doesn't even seem just. It seems actually pretty capricious. What about heaven? Well, I don't want to bother you too much. Jesus didn't talk about heaven ever. He talked about the kingdom of God, which isn't heaven. It's like what it means to live in God's family now and maybe later. So when Jesus was around, when Paul was around, another new idea is the R word, resurrection. Not in the Hebrew Bible, nowhere. Not. Of course, some things happen between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. There's a span of like 400 years, not including Daniel. About 150 years before Jesus, there was this really awful ruler, if you were Jewish, called Antiochus Epiphanes. He was Greek, and he decided everybody should do the Greek thing. So much so that he went into the temple in Jerusalem and sacrificed a pig to Zeus. If you know anything about Jewish folk, no pigs, no Zeus. No one goes into the Holy of Holies except the high priest once a year. So this is like, to use the book of Daniel, the abomination that causes desolation. That's the event. If you had any of the Torah, the Hebrew scriptures, and you didn't turn it in, they burned it with you. If you circumcised your baby, you wore it dead around your neck, and then you were burned alive. This is Antiochus Epiphanes, 167 BCE. A group of people called the Maccabees decide they've had enough, and they rebel. Like, they start a guerrilla war that ultimately they kind of, winning's not the right word, but they end up getting control of the land. Turns out some of those people die real young. For the Torah, for God, for circumcision, for the temple. That's not fair. They're like losing their life early for these things. So the earliest idea of the resurrection is you get your life back. You die young, get your life back. You were cheated out of living, you get what you lost. It was not an infinite idea. It was not. People who died young got to live. So that's early, 167, like almost 200 years before Jesus. Then there's some other folks that start thinking, well, look, we see that righteous people suffer. People who do good, they don't always get materially rewarded. So how do we take care of God's justice? They must get their reward later. And the thinking goes, people who are naughty, they must get their punishment later. You see how that goes? I'm not saying they're wrong. What I'm saying is these are new ideas when Paul and Jesus are writing. When we get to the Middle Ages, they're doctrines. I hope we get the difference. New ideas, if you've ever wondered, why doesn't the Bible talk about heaven? It's because there wasn't a doctrine of heaven when they wrote the Bible. Why didn't the Bible talk about hell? By the way, it doesn't. It talks about a lake of fire. What do you do with fire? You burn trash. You don't torture people in fire. You burn trash till it's gone. And then there's nothing left to torture. Does this make sense what I'm saying? I'm not saying our doctrines are wrong. I'm saying they're not original.
I just, tracking what you're saying and trying to hear with the ears of someone who hasn't read a lot of N.T. Wright. A lot of what you're saying, I just like about heaven and hell and kind of the context, like this saturates N.T. Wright's scholarship. So if you're hearing something that Mike's saying right now, and you're like, that's really interesting, I want to think more about that, you're gonna get a lot more.
Yeah.
So, say.
Yeah, because again, it's the difference between a middle-aged doctrine and a nascent idea in the ancient world. Did I lose anybody yet? Or maybe I piqued your interest in something else. Joe?
I don't think, anyone forgets throughout the Gospels as the words spoken by Jesus. He was looking at the Pharisees and saying, yes, I can use my hands, food, et cetera, I feel, yeah, he was a heck of a rebel. And he was in the face of Jews saying, your law is not the law, in my opinion.
Yeah, and what N.T. Wright's going to remind us of very carefully, that's really critical, is that Jesus was not anti-Jewish. He was Jewish. And like other rabbis before him, he's saying there's the letter of the Torah and the traditions you've applied to it, and then there's the Spirit of God in the Torah. How many books of the Bible did Jesus write? None. What was Jesus's Bible? The Hebrew Bible. Did Jesus think it was incomplete? No. If Jesus thought the Hebrew Bible was bad, he'd have written some books, don't you think? So the Christian Bible are additions to help us understand how it is that Jesus represents the Spirit of God in the Torah in inventory ways that we were missing. Not because it's wrong, because we were missing it. I can't argue anything else, or I would be an anti-Semite, and I'm not. I hope you hear what I'm saying, right? You'll hear this idea called supersessionism. Supersessionism says Judaism bad, incomplete, Jesus founded Christianity. Jesus founded nothing. If anything, Paul gets the credit for founding Christianity as different from Judaism. Jesus died a Jew. And maybe it's helpful to hear when we use that word Jew, it's really disingenuous. We think of the word Jew as, oh, you belong to a religious tradition, and you go to the synagogue, and you don't eat pork, and you don't do this or that. Like it's this sort of well-defined cognitive set of practices and rituals. The word Jew in the Bible means someone who lives in Judea. There were lots of people who lived in Judea who worshipped Zeus. There were people who lived in Judea who killed their firstborn children to Milcom and Chemosh and the other one. There's like 3 different names. So, Jew is a geographic designation. Judah is a territory like Harris County, probably about the same size, not a religious category. So, Pilate says, here is the king of the Judeans, not the people who go to synagogue, who wear the tzitzit and have curls. Not what Jesus is accused of. He's not a religious figure for Pilate. He wants to be an autonomous king of a territory. I hope that makes sense. He's not killing a religious leader. He's killing a political insurgent. That's Pilate's idea. The people who say, the Jews who gather to say, his blood be on us and our children, crucify him. They may not have been Jewish at all, but they lived in that area. I hope we hear the difference. I want to make sure we all get terms. Have I lost anybody yet? Yeah, Mike.
I've always been confused about Paul's attempt in Romans and in Galatians 4. He said on the one hand, that we're heirs of Abraham. On the other hand, to make a distinction between the first covenant and the second covenant. And I've never believed that Paul actually pulls that off. That God didn't abandon the people of Judea, the Jews, on the one hand, and that God's created something new without being supersession in the Christian community. And well, I see Paul kind of struggling like crazy to say something he isn't convincing about. Does Wright get to that when you?
Yes. And like all of us, he would like to have his cake and eat it too, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
And we will often find that tension between here's this, but also this. And if you did the Corinthians group, right, you'll often hear Paul do a thing we don't recognize because he was a master of rhetoric. Jesus does this too. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, but I tell you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. You're familiar with this, right? Well, we're not always familiar that Paul does this over and over again in his letters. Slaves, obey your masters is an idiom. But I tell you, masters, love your slaves. If you love your slave, can you treat them like property? So sometimes we hear Paul is upholding an institution when in fact he's absolutely undoing it. Wives, submit to your husbands, you've heard it said. But I tell you, husbands, love your wives. That seems to undo one submitting to the other. Argument, counter argument. What Paul doesn't do is say, you've heard it said, but I tell you, because it was presumed they knew what was said. And here comes the instruction. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Fathers, do not embitter your children. That's interesting, isn't it? Is Paul calcifying blind obedience to our parents, or is he in fact saying, do not embitter your children? Interesting to think through, isn't it? It's a master of rhetoric to put two ideas together that have nothing to do with each other, I think. And you're going to see that with his view on what happens to Jews. I think. Yes, sir.
It supports what you were saying a moment ago about the Hebrew Bible being, or the Torah not being wrong. It's just how it's viewed. What are the words saying? And remove that filter and look at the same words in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one thing that we don't always recognize, and I tried to allude to this in the introduction, there wasn't, and even when we're talking about religious folk at the time of Jesus and Paul, it's not like there was one Judaism. There's at least 4 that we know well. I don't know if you know this, but there's more than 100 kinds of Baptist that are like main line, like they replicate. You've probably heard of the Southern Baptist Church, right? That's the biggest one, but there's the American Baptists and the Free Will Gospel Baptists and the Gospel Baptists and the Free Will. I mean, there's all these ones, right? Just to give you my favorite story that you've heard me say, outside Atlanta and the big water source of Lake Lanier, within a mile, there's 3 churches. There's Hope Baptist Church. Half a mile later, there's New Hope Baptist Church. Half a mile later, there's Real Hope Baptist Church. Judaism at the time of Paul and Jesus wasn't so different. I'm sure you've heard that there's Sadducees, Pharisees, maybe you've heard of the Zealots, maybe you've heard of the Essenes who lived in Qumran. But it's a little disingenuous to even say all the Sadducees thought like this, because they didn't. All the Pharisees were like this, because they weren't. But these four groups are maybe just sort of worth mentioning briefly. The Sadducees read only Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That was it. When you died, you were dead, period. They, in general, were the ones with political power who controlled the temple at Jerusalem. Really small group of folk. And they would do anything to save the temple because you had to have it. So when Jesus looks like a threat to the temple, they're ready to do away with him because they can't lose the temple. Does this make sense? They don't believe in a resurrection of the dead. You already know that because that's what Jesus does in the Synoptics. It's about who belongs to somebody in marriage when they die, right? So Sadducees, Pharisees, what about them? Pharisees were liberals. They read the Psalms and the prophets, like the Hebrew Bible, like kind of all of it. Some did. What they really wanted to do was not just fulfill God's will and call for humanity at the temple, but in everyday ethical living. So in the ancient world, religion was a function of priests and cults and festival dates. The Pharisees said religion was a way of life. The way you treat your children, what you do when you wake up, what you do before you go to bed. Like this is the worldview of the Pharisees. And what do you know? The Pharisees get called out a lot in the Bible, but if you had a flat tire, your first call is to a Pharisee because they will fix it. The Pharisees were the people who tithed they tithed 10% of everything, not just what they were told to. Why'd they do that? Because they knew other people weren't tithing at all, and they were covering. The Pharisees fasted once a week. If you're Jewish, you fast one day a year on Yom Kippur. That's the only day. Why'd they do it every week? To cover the people who weren't. So you already hear religion is not an individual relationship, it's a community one. The Pharisees are covering for each other. Doesn't sound that bad to me. Sounds pretty darn good, right? Paul's a Pharisee. By the way, Jesus is too, because he quotes Isaiah. There's the Essenes who live at Qumran. They're the ones with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Maybe. What were they like? They thought that everybody should live like a priest, which meant they washed themselves 7 times a day. They wore linen clothes. They didn't have sexual relationships. Everybody lived priestly purity. They believed in the priesthood of all believers, not just Levitical descendants. The Essenes were sure the temple had been corrupted by people's infidelity, and they wanted a new one that was pure and holy. They thought God would give it to them. They were living as a righteous remnant. That's them. In the middle of the desert, because nobody liked them. That's where you go, like far away, because nobody likes you. That's what they did. They are the ones who introduced, there's some really good scholarship about this, demonology. Because in the ancient world, you know, you heard of the Socratic method, where you pull knowledge out of people they already have. Plato says that was the demon of Socrates, his divinely given gift. In the Greek mind, your demon is God may manifest in you. For the Essenes, demons are all bad. They're evil corruptions, and they're the ones who change the New Testament to say all demons are bad. Demon means unclean spirit in Greek. All it means, unclean spirit. Doesn't mean red thing with spade tail and pitchfork. That's middle-aged doctrine. What it means at the time of Paul is being disputed. Then there's this last group called the Zealots. And the Zealots are Zionists. They're Zionists. And they say, we want temple independence. And there's these Roman people here, so we will fight and kill them at all costs. Doesn't sound very religious, does it? Yeah, okay, it's Zionism. They could have been Pharisees and Sadducees and Zealots at the same time. Jesus has two of those in his disciples. Simon the Zealot, who is somebody who will murder Roman guards to cause chaos and panic to try to get freedom. And he has another one, Judas Iscariot. There's the subgroup of Zealots called the Sicarii, which is a kind of knife, Judas the knifer. And there's some real evidence that people during festival days or in crowds would in fact get up next to some Roman centurions or some Roman soldiers in a crowd, knife them and walk away. If you want to kill somebody, your best bet is Mardi Gras. You probably get away with it. Same deal. You kill them and walk away. Who knows who did it? It's ancient, you decide, terrorism or freedom fighting, which are really the same thing, depending on whether you like what they're doing. Judas, Simon are zealots. Probably they're also Pharisees. So these aren't distinct identities. They can all conflate. But we know quite a bit about those four. And it doesn't always say, a rich young ruler who was only a Sadducee came to Jesus and said, a rich ruler comes to Jesus, right? That's what we hear. We don't know what denomination they are, because then as now, not everybody believed or did the same thing. Was that helpful? Well, I better call time. So next week, you'll have read Galatians. We'll start with Professor Wright, and then we'll get to respond. Thanks for being here. Really. Oh, yes, ma'am.
For those interested in N.T. Wright, he has a really good podcast channel. So
Thanks, Bob.
just for your information.